So limitation number one, there are many potential biases with our norm reference tests. When you're in graduate school, through all your professional development, you've heard this. It's become the rule change and the guidance has become even more explicit in how we handle some of these biases. But I think it's important that we spend some time talking about this. So I'm going to break this into two types of biases. One is the more obvious biases. So with these more obvious biases, we have things like English proficiency. So if you have someone who doesn't speak English or has limited English proficiency, obviously a test looking at your English skills is going to be biased, right? You're not going to get an accurate indication of the student's full communication potential if you're using tests designed for monolingual English students. Right. So hopefully, this is something we're all on the same page. I'm preaching to the choir here. Even translations, if we're working with a translator and having a translator do a test for us, those can be quite problematic as well. And even if we have a bilingual student who has some English proficiency or even a decent level or good English proficiency, there still can be some bias there. We know that a bilingual student, their English performance is going to generally be lower than a monolingual English speaking peer, okay? So like I said, we know that the English proficiency, that can really introduce a lot of bias. Also something like dialect spoken. And in particular, I'm going to talk about African-American English or Black English. And a lot of our norm reference tests examine things like inflectional morphology. How are you doing at including these little grammatical morphemes, dropping present progressive ing, third person singular? And we know from monolingual English speaking, children, that's a good indicator of whether or not you have a language disorder. However, that shares the features of the very systematic and regular rules within African-American English. So if we're looking at something like inflectional morphology with a student who speaks African-American English, then that test is going to be biased. So with these obvious types of biases, ultimately the norm reference tests, they don't add much value or they add very little value. The standard scores, the percentiles, if it's not adding value, they really shouldn't be reported. And really, this is mainly just a plug for Courtney's upcoming presentation. She has 2 full presentations on doing comprehensive assessments of students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I would be remiss if I didn't talk about some of these more obvious biases. Now I want to talk a little bit about bias in disguise, right? Some of these less obvious biases that we can see within our norm reference tests, all right? And so one of the main things I'm going to talk about today is this broad category of biases called format bias, right? So this is where we give our student a test and they're not very familiar with how that test works. Right? They're not familiar with the format of the test. So if you're not familiar with the format of a test, you're not going to perform very well. And if you aren't performing well because of the format, your scores are going to be artificially low, right? So I might score low on this particular test, making it look like I have some sort of impairment, when really my full potential is being masked by my inability to do the test. Okay, and this isn't just for students, this is true for us, right? I always feel like I have absolutely no vocabulary whenever I sit down to do a crossword puzzle. That's because I do about 3 items in a crossword puzzle once every 5 years. I don't have a lot of familiarity with that task. If you looked at my visual perceptual skills based on Candy Crush, I am not going to look like I have very strong visual perceptual skills. Right? So this is true for us as well. If we're familiar with the task, with the format, we do better. If we're less familiar, we don't do as well. So what does this look like? Well, as we're going through this, I think it's really helpful to think about our Western values. We can also call these Eurocentric values, mainstream American values, but we can think about these different types of values that I would argue, and many others would argue, are part of our mainstream culture here in the United States. As we're looking through these, we can think about how these show up in the format of some of our tests, especially our norm reference tests. And I'm going to show some examples here. And if you were not acculturated with some of these values, right? If you, if you don't share some of these values, then you don't have as much experience with them and with tasks related to them, and your performance may not look like someone who does share these values. If you're like, what's he talking about? I'm going to show you some very clear examples. So most of our tests, most of our norm reference tests, they assume that children share these common beliefs and values. And if they don't share these values, if a student does not share these values, the task is going to be unfamiliar and the test will be biased. So just like Candy Crush is biased against me for my visual perceptual skills, some of these tasks are going to be biased against our students who don't have a lot of experience doing tasks that require these values. All right. So one of the values I showed before was the value of speed, right? So, time is money. We value speed in America, and it's kind of a Western value. So we can think about how this might look on one of our norm reference tests. So if you have an expressive vocabulary test, one of the rules is you must answer in 5 seconds. And I would say that this is pretty consistent with expectations of kids in a mainstream American preschool. You're asked a question, you're expected to answer quickly. You're participating in story time and the teacher asks you a question or you comment on it, you're expected to do it quickly. So if a student shares that value, and they have a strong vocabulary, they're going to be able to answer quickly. Now, if you have a weaker vocabulary, you're probably going to have weak lexical representation, and you're going to have more difficulty accessing those words quickly. So if you share this value of speed, if everyone shares this value of speed, it's going to differentiate fairly well the kids who have stronger vocabulary skills and weaker vocabulary skills. Now, if we contrast that with a student who doesn't share that value of speed, they may answer really slowly because this is a really weird thing. I haven't had a lot of experience doing this. I'm not familiar with the format of this test. So it might look like they have a smaller vocabulary when actually the format of the test has some bias in it. And they may answer slowly and get items incorrect. Kids with weak vocabulary who don't share this value of speed, they may answer slowly as well. Let's think about things like individualistic versus collective cultures. We saw in those Western values, the individual achievement, the value of individual achievement, right? So individualistic cultures, students, they know they're expected to be performing their best. There's usually competition between students, and there's a lot of value placed on your own personal achievement. If we contrast that with more collective cultures, we see that students are more concerned about the group's performance, and there's more emphasis on helping all of the students and making sure all of the students are succeeding, including those struggling students. So what might this look like in a testing scenario? So if if we have a student from an individualistic culture, has experience with that, has instilled that value of individual achievement, if we bring them into our testing session and we say, I want to see, how well you do, they're going to be, expecting and knowing that the expectation is that they need to perform. Their performance is being judged. Now, someone in a more collective culture, they may not share that. They may not see, what's the big deal? Like, this is kind of weird. And instead of how am I performing, how might my peers perform? Another thing that when we think about our norm reference tests is this thing called frustration tolerance. This is really a key skill within our norm reference tests, right? When we give our tests, we have to achieve a ceiling. You have to, perform and keep performing even when it gets hard. You have to tolerate that frustration. And we assume that people are coming in with a certain level of frustration tolerance, probably coming from that desire to show your individual achievement. if you don't have as much experience with the frustration tolerance, you might not know that this is an expectation. And if this is something new for your student, they may not really understand that expectation or just don't have as much experience and just kind of break down a little bit. So I've gone on a lot with the format bias here. I need to move on, but we can just think about how familiar are our students? How familiar are they doing with things like interacting with picture probes? How familiar are they with things like asking known information questions? Like when we ask them, point to the ball, maybe they're thinking that's really weird that you want me to point to the ball, or you're asking, where is the ball, when you know exactly where it is. What's it like playing with an unfamiliar adult as a true communication partner? So you might be saying, come on, really? Is this really that big of a deal? All of my students, they can finish my test. I don't see this as really much of a problem. But the thing to think about with this, especially this bias and all of these biases, is that it's not an either or issue. It's not either you understand the format and you can do it, or you don't understand the format and you can't do it at all. It has a relative impact on your performance. And there's this really beautiful old study showing this. So this was, again, it's a classic study. It's an oldie, and it wasn't a huge sample, but they had 24 students taking the preschool language assessment instrument. And this is getting back to what I talked about before. How familiar are you interacting with those two-dimensional pictures? And what the authors argued was that the African-American children in this particular sample, they had less familiarity with the traditional administration, right? They had less familiarity with interacting with those two-dimensional pictures. They had more familiarity with interacting with actual objects. So they did two different forms of this preschool language assessment instrument. The traditional administration was just with the pictures. The thematic was with actual three-dimensional objects. And what they found is that when we did the thematic administration, when we did using the format that was familiar with both groups, there were no differences. And when we did the traditional, so the one that was unfamiliar with the African-American students, they performed significantly worse. Right? And it's not a huge difference. It's not that they couldn't do this at all, but it's that we see some difference there. And what I really like, I like this slide. It's a beautiful slide, but I really like this next slide. Okay. So what this is showing 4 different levels of complexity with the items. So the item number 4 is, the items in this 4th group are the most complex. The items in the 1st group are the least complex. And what we see is with this unfamiliar format, we don't see any difference between the groups initially, right? And then as we go on, we see that the differences amplify, right? We see that as the items get harder, the white students had relative success compared to the African-American students. And when they administered the more familiar format, those differences disappeared. Okay, so I mean, this could be so I don't think we're talking about the difference between a standard score of 100 and a standard score of 50. But if there's some of these format biases in our test, it could be the difference between a standard score of a 75 and an 85, right? Which, as we typically interpret tests, could have a pretty sizable impact on the interpretation. Okay, so what do we do? And this is kind of a silly picture, but we have some options and we can choose our adventure of our options that we want to do. So what are some things we can do? Now, this is my opportunity to bring in one of the things that I really like about this rule change. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to look at this rule change. So I'm not going to read it directly to you, but the old guidance document that we had, it's your first stop was performance on 2 norm reference tests. The revised criteria now say you need to choose at least 2 of these following. And we have this battery of tests that we have available. And within this battery, norm reference tests is one of the 4 types of assessments that are available, right? So this is just empowering us to realize that norm reference tests are a powerful tool when they're appropriate. If it's not appropriate, we have all of these other powerful tools that are at our that are available for us. Okay, so we'll go through some scenarios where we may or may not use those. So if we have a student who is an English learner, who has limited English proficiency, those tests for monolingual English speakers, they're most likely not going to be appropriate, right? The student's going to struggle with the format, with the language, and then also when we're comparing them to the normative sample of monolingual English speaking children, they're not going to be represented in that sample. So some other questions we might be interested in is, how well did they learn new language features? And we know that's a really powerful assessment method called dynamic assessment. We can look and say, how well is this student doing in school? We can do observations of their performance. We can do interviews with teachers and parents. We can look at academic tests. We can look at writing samples. So we have all of these different tools available to us, and norm reference tests do not necessarily even have to be part of our assessment battery. Now, I'm just going to say right here, when you leave this session today, you're not going to say, I absolutely know how to do a comprehensive evaluation for every student. We would never be able to do that in an hour and a half. But this is priming to show that there is going to be a sequence of sessions and guidance and materials to really give you some more information on how to do some of these other types of assessments. The main goal for today is to recognize that these other types of assessments can add powerful information in these different situations. So, maybe we have a referral, for a student, and we're really unsure if we're going to be able to engage with them. Maybe we're told this student can only talks with their teacher. They don't talk with anyone else. But hey, you're an SLP, you have your SLP magic, she'll talk to you, right? So that very well may happen. But if that SLP magic doesn't work and we feel like, I don't think I'm really getting accurate, valid data from this norm reference test, can we look at the language that's used with teachers or parents through a language sample analysis? Can we observe across different settings and see some differences? Can we look at how the communication changes with different levels of scaffolding, different levels of teaching, different levels of instruction and support through a dynamic assessment? Now, what if we gave a test, but the student didn't seem to get it, right? It didn't really seem like they were understanding what they were supposed to do. I don't think this was an accurate indication. Can we do any digging to see if there are some of those format biases, right? Maybe there's a certain language feature that we're interested in, and we want to look at that in more detail. So we could do some probes or some dynamic assessment. Can we, if this is an older student, can they describe technical processes? Are they participating in the different classes? Are they accessing the curriculum the way they need to access it? And we have all of these tools at our disposal to be able to do that. So that is the first section that we have here. I'll take a second here to catch my breath, because like I said, I get very excited about this content and this topic. And Andrea, if there are any questions that you'd like for this part, you can say them. Otherwise, I will move on.
I just see on our Jamboard, there was a true false for you, John.
Okay. Uh-oh. I got 50-50 shot of getting it right.
If the normed group of students or children of a test is very different from the group of students you are trying to use that test with, we should use extreme caution in how we interpret those results.
I'm going to say true, right? And hopefully we all say true. And I would say, hopefully we're all coming from this with this shared understanding. And I think there's really been a big recognition of how there can be some of those types of biases. If we have a student, who has, from a different culture that is not represented in the normative sample, that's going to be an unfair comparison. And I'll talk more about that. I'll get in the next sections more into why we see some of those types of biases and how it really, at the end of the day, impacts the scores that we get.